This is the style that you are trying to achieve, Harlem Deco. That's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be diving into Harlem Deco interior design style. So, when we think about how to summarize Harlem Deco, it's a fusion of cultural elegance and resilience that's carved into the heart of Harlem. So, a part of this design style truly pulls from the Harlem Renaissance, which is why it's such a beautiful blend, because you're taking an existing design style like Deco, some people say Deco, we're gonna say Art Deco, and then you're taking the history and the depth of the Harlem Renaissance and you're pairing that with this design style to essentially, this is the side of the space. Okay. I'm not going to be engaging with the comments too much because I am recording, just so y'all know, but essentially we're going to take the history of the Harlem Renaissance. We won't dive too much into that from a historian's perspective, but we will. We would be remiss not to acknowledge how that has shaped the Harlem Deco design style. But it's about legacy, rebellion, and pride. So today we'll see how these elements evolved into a design that reclaims space and reflects the excellence to which we exude. Yeah, I'm going to dive right in here. So the kind of overarching categories, we talk about the historical context, we look at the core design elements, and then we review the cultural influence and symbolism. From the historical context perspective, in the early 20th century, which is, again, like, think about the Harlem Renaissance, Harlem became the nucleus for a cultural revolution. So people flocked to this epicenter, and these people, in layman's terms, were visionaries, they were intellectuals, they were musicians and artists, everyday people who were willing to lean into and kind of take ownership of their own natural gifts and beings, and then be defined as the visionaries, the intellects, the musicians, and the artists, so on and so forth. But they were all seeking refuge and opportunity. And their homes essentially became more than just shelters. They were expressions of defiance, beauty, and identity in a segregated world. So that's what the sum total of the Harlem Renaissance, in my opinion, is. But just to name a few icons, because I would be remiss not to, there was Langston Hughes, there was Zora Neale Hurston, so on and so forth, W.E.B. Du Bois, so on and so forth. But when we look at the history behind these individuals and how they shaped such a time in our history, that's how we arrive at a design style as such. Now looking at more of the design elements. So when you look at the architectural language, Harlem brownstones, though they were narrow, had these high ceilings and grand stoops. And inside, you kind of watch the evolution of what I would say Harlem Deco. It was a Harlem Deco takeover, is the best way to describe it. So you had these geometric designs, polished mirrors. It essentially became the evolution of the performance in space. And when I say space, I'm talking about the interior space, not like above us type of thing. But yeah, it became a voice within interiors and how we arrive at this design style today. When we look at the additional design elements of the textiles and patterns, the textiles in Harlem Deco were expressive, or as expressive as the music was at that time, and it inspired a lot of the choices that were made to kind of concoct this design style. So there was velvets, there was satins, there were mohair, but you can't help but often you see how they were paired with the often adorned by African patterns like chevrons or the Greek keys, where statements were power, beauty, and heritage through these elements. And then again, looking more at kind of like the African elements, you had the kente stripes, you had the Kuba geometrics, and then you had the Adenkra symbols that also showed up in a lot of these designs. And then when we dive into the materiality of it, the materials weren't just luxurious, they were statements and testaments to the Black craftsmanship that we saw. So mahogany, marble and velvet were used not just for their beauty, but as symbols of transformation. So they were taking something ordinary and turning them into this extraordinary shape that essentially defined these spaces. And then when we look at the color palettes, I think the color palette was one of those things that really, I think it's what we gravitate toward today, which is why so many people have felt this like resonating factor with Harlem Deco, because the colors were rich and they were powerful. So we saw oxblood, we saw sapphire and champagne, right? Just to name a few. But they weren't just as design choices, these were also symbols. So we talk about textures and patterns, but the colors played a huge part in the symbolism of what Harlem Deco is. Oxblood for depth and power, sapphire for confidence, and champagne for joy. And when we look at the overall cultural influence and symbolism, Harlem Deco didn't just celebrate beauty, it told a story. It told a story through the symbolisms of the patterns. It told a story through the colors. So when you think about the African and Caribbean motifs, those beautiful quilts that we saw in a lot of the designs at that time and how that's kind of evolved into today, it was essentially like the stories were being woven into these specific interiors and styles. And they weren't just decoration, it was a cultural declaration. So not just decoration, but a cultural declaration. And it's important that we understand the difference. It was about the roots and legacies and resilience. It was also about the resistance at that time that we saw as a people and how that showed up in some of the choices that we made from an interior perspective. So every pattern, every color choice, it was a part of the narrative. And when we look at the influence and symbolism from a very literal perspective, it was about the art, it was about the jazz accents, the Harlem, or the Art Deco glamour, which is how a lot of this stuff was influenced, right? When we see the brass and the shiny elements, the glass top tables, this all drew from the Harlem Renaissance as well as the combination of the Art Deco movement. So when we look at the combination of the Harlem Renaissance and the creativity that stemmed from that, and you combine that with these definitive elements of Art Deco, that's how we got this creative explosion, which is now Harlem Deco. From the classic Art Deco elements, a lot of the mirrors, symmetry, and luxe finishes are reimagined through a cultural lens for us. So where it was a part of like defining this design style, it didn't necessarily take the exact shape of it. So we did reimagine this from a cultural lens. And at its core, Harlem Deco is about empowerment, using design as a form of pride, resilience, and celebration. So we looked at what Art Deco did, or Art Deco did, and we rolled that into, okay, what does this feel and look like from a cultural perspective? So when you walk into a room, I'm declining any invites, sorry y'all. When you walk into a room and you experience Harlem Deco for the first time, it doesn't just whisper, it does declare. So it's bold, it feels like an experience, it feels like a voice is being heard through a design style. And that's what I believe we're meant to feel with design. It's meant to be a reflection of us. It's meant to be a part of the cultural statement. So it's now using these design styles as a way to transform that into an interior language. So, as I've now gone through Harlem Deco, I appreciate all y'all who are in the live right now. I am recording this for YouTube, but I wanted to share kind of my thought process and how I approach a lot of these conversations in an organic way. But the deck, the information will all be accessible on YouTube. I also think when you look at Harlem Deco, you can see the bold rhythm that was brought to life through this design style. So as we dive through all of them that are included in the book, I think something that's beautiful about Harlem Deco and why it stands out is it has a voice that is so transferable, meaning I believe that Harlem Deco over the next few decades will just continue to evolve into its own version of a modernized form as it continues to kind of like take up space and become more of its own, stand on its own 2 feet. But when you look at Harlem Deco, there is this form of like power that it exudes. So now it's just understanding how do we lean into that in an organic way. So when you think about that oxblood sofa that I included in the mood board, it's okay, what does this look like in a smaller way? How does it just show up in art? How does it just show up in a coffee table or a side table? It's transferring that voice across the space instead of just kind of like trying to fix our mind on what it should look like from a literal perspective. Again, when we look at Harlem Deco, it is a part of it's something bigger than us. It is a part of an overall movement, but it's understanding how do we continue to pull that into our everyday life? How do we continue to introduce that in a design style, whether it's from scratch or just small elements of it? I appreciate y'all tuning in. Thank you so much. And I believe that's all for Harlem Deco. And I look forward to sharing more of these design styles and unraveling more of these as we move along here.